All right, so we're looking at Russia in the early modern era. If you forgot the dates, early modern era is 1450 to 1750. Again, I hope you put that on the inside cover of your notebook or someplace easily accessible, all the breakdown dates of the time periods. If you didn't, that's definitely something that you should do soon. But this is Russia during that same time frame. Now, before we left for the break, we were talking about all the things taking place in Europe during the same time frame. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Age of Absolutism, the Enlightenment. All of that stuff is going on in Western Europe. We want to find out now what's happening in Russia on the other side of the continent. All right, so a little bit of geography first. This is a kind of unique view that you may not be used to seeing because it's not the normal global view. This is kind of the stretched around view from the top of the globe. So Western Europe is over here, a little bit off the map. The focus is primarily on northern Russia. And this is going to give us some sense of where Russia begins. And so we're going to start from this small purplish, bluish area, Moscow becoming the newest capital during Mongol occupation, and then spreading out from here as the Mongols are slowly pushed back. And so you saw in your reading quiz, that was the major focus of Russian expansion and conquest. It's almost single-minded. We've seen other places where they're like, yeah, let's spread out to get more wealth or more power or go meet new people. With the Russians, it's very, very single-minded. We are expanding for one reason, to push the Mongols so far back that they can never, ever threaten us again. And so if you look at where they expand, where are they going? East, into Central Asia, which is where the Mongols came from. And so we start with this purplish, bluish area, and then we spread mostly east, a little bit north because you want to, get more coastal area. Why would you want more coastal area? Trade. But most of it's going this way. And then we see this third generation, or I guess the second generation. Sorry, I got my colors mixed up. The green comes after the purple. That's all mostly this way. Once this is secure, you can go get more coastal area for trading. So then we jump down here. We'll start with the purple, and then the yellow is Peter the Great. By this time, the Mongols really aren't an issue anymore. They're no longer a threat. But what do you notice about the expansion? Right, and it's still mostly focused on the east. Why would you go that way? Nick? Exactly. Lots of land and nobody to give you a hard time about it. What would happen if you tried to go west? Right, you'd get shot. You'd run into a whole bunch of major civilizations, either in Eastern Europe or not much past that, Central and Western Europe. So where's the path of least resistance if you're Russia and you want to expand? It's this way. Yeah. Now, if you notice, it says China right here. They're not really pushing China much either. Why would you not do that? Because China's strong. So again, they're picking their battles. We don't want to mess with the rest of Eastern Europe and Western Europe. We don't want to mess with China. There's a big gaping hole here. The Ottomans. Definitely don't want to mess with them. There's another group over here, much like the Ottomans, called the Safavids. You're going to meet them in chapter 21. So Russia's goal, push back the Mongols so we don't have to worry about them. And then let's try not to piss off anybody else. Yes, sir. Russia is going to butt heads with a lot of people, especially down here in the Ottoman Empire, over here in Eastern Europe a little bit. But they have one great advantage, which is as they're conquering all this over here, does anybody else want it? No. Is there anybody else close enough to take it?
No. Siberia?
No. Right. Plus, I mean, nobody really wants most of northern Siberia because it's cold. It's like conquering northern Canada. It'd be like, here, take it. Go be cold. But Russia's in a great position where there are no other significant empires over here that they have to fight with. Nick?
Didn't Peter the Great fight wars with Sweden as well?
Mm-hmm. And that's where you're going to see a little bit of this westward expansion finally, and then ultimately Catherine the Great, who will go to war with some of these Eastern European empires. And again, you've got these maps in your book, so if you want to look at it again later, you can. But I know you guys typically skip over maps when you're reading the chapter, so I like to try to show you what you can learn from them, even though there aren't any words. What's that? Well, yeah, right, there's names of countries and things, but you don't often get the explanation for why the map's important. All right, so fun facts about Russia. They are a geographically open nation. What do we mean by that? Good. They don't have natural boundaries to keep people out. Who does that sound like that we've learned about before? Might have to go back a little ways. Mesopotamia and India. Except Russia's even more open. Russia has virtually no geographical barriers. There is nothing to keep people out. Now, there's a silver lining to that, though. It will actually make life easier. Why? It's easier to expand. Because there's no geographical barriers. There's no huge mountain ranges you have to get over. There's no massive bodies of water that you have to get around or cross. There's no deserts that keep people out. It's just mile after mile after mile, for the most part, of rolling grassland and forest. And as we learned back in chapter 9, when we learned about Byzantium and the Kievan Rus, Russia from the very beginning is what we would consider to be a multi-ethnic civilization, started by a variety of ethnic and cultural groups. What's the upside of that? Having lots of different cultures. Right. Cultural diffusion, lots of ideas, lots of variety. What's the downside? Different beliefs. What else? Different nationalities. Sahil? Yeah. People are territorial. You see it in the cafeteria. Different groups of people sitting at different tables. The upside of that is it makes this school an amazingly diverse place. It's one of the reasons why I love teaching here. Because you have people from so many backgrounds, people from so many countries, people that speak so many different languages, practice different religions. You know how cool I think it is that when I teach a class on world religions, that I have people from pretty much every major religion in the classroom? I think it's amazing. But what's the downside of all that diversity? What's that? They don't always agree. You get conflict, you get disagreement. And so that's what's going to happen in Russia. There's a lot of cultural diversity. There's a lot of languages. There's a lot of religions. There's a lot of food. There's a lot of clothing. And there's a lot of disagreement because they don't all agree. And Russia today is still dealing with this. They're still dealing with this identity crisis. What does it mean to be Russian? What does a Russian look like? Are they white? Are they a little bit darker? Are they quasi-Asian looking? Do they look more like they're from Europe? What language do they speak? Do they speak traditional Russian? What religion do they practice? So this is a problem for Russia from day one until present day. And so once you understand that, does this third point make more sense? Early governments are limited to small holdings, ruled by local princes. Why would that be? Right. It makes sense because they would want to be with their own little cultural or ethnic group. They don't want to be unified. There wouldn't be anybody that could unify them and say, hey, all you guys should just get along and like each other and put aside your differences. There was nobody in Russia to do that until who shows up? The Mongols. The Mongols are like, look, we don't care how different you are from each other. We will kill all of you, regardless of skin color or hair color or religion. We will kill all of you unless you give us your money. And now all the people in Russia start to unify. Because they're like, oh crap, well, I'd rather be friends with the other Russian people because we can at least work together and save ourselves from the Mongols. Right. Now, once the Mongols are gone, maybe we can just go right back to hating each other and, things can go back to the way that they were. Now, who did we say primarily influenced the Kievan Rus at the beginning? Byzantium. And so is it really surprising that Eastern Orthodoxy would be the most common religion in Russia? No. But is that the only religion in Russia? No. What else do they have? Just guess. Islam? A little bit, but where is Buddhism most heavily concentrated? China and India. So they'd have to cover some ground to get there. Nick?
The religions that the Scandinavians brought there,
What we would probably just lump together as the pagan traditions. Spirit worship, worshiping nature, worshiping trees and rocks and things like that. You're still going to have a lot of those practices. Are you going to have Roman Catholicism? A little bit. Certainly not the majority, but some. So again, as with everything else, there's a lot of religious diversity. What does that typically cause? Conflict. Now, once Byzantium declines and then falls, what does that do to Russia? Right, Byzantium was Russia's biggest trading partner. So with Byzantium gone, what happens to Russia? They're kind of isolated now, right? It's like they lost their best friend. Their best friend moved away / died. Well, I was trying to put a nicer twist on it. It would be like if your best friend moved away. But, right, Byzantium didn't move away, they died. So Russia's kind of isolated. They don't really have a healthy relationship with Western Europe. They definitely don't have a healthy relationship with the Islamic empires. China's really far away from Western Russia. So who does Russia have left? Nobody. They're all alone. They're sitting by themselves. It's sad. And then who shows up? The Mongols. You gotta kick them while they're down. And so with Russia being conquered by the Mongols, there is some good that comes from it. Obviously, the death and destruction and mayhem and chaos are all bad. But out of that, Russia's centralized. And they're connected culturally to the Mongol Empire. They're no longer alone. They are now being influenced by the Mongols. And because the Mongols are so open-minded, Russia's being influenced by all the people that influence the Mongols, like China. Yeah, so? No. Once the Mongols leave, Russia loses a lot of those connections again. But it's kind of a jump start. And so once the Mongols leave and the Russians begin conquering, that will reintroduce them to some of these other areas. We good so far? Out of curiosity, how many of you really felt like you struggled reading chapter 18? Out of curiosity, how many of you read chapter 18? How many of you did not read chapter 18? Merry Christmas. Okay. Indeed. All right, so for those of you that I know will now go home and read chapter 18, I hope all of this will help it make more sense. All right, so for Russia, the big hallmark event for them is the Mongol invasion. The Mongol invasion will completely change the course that Russia was on. Because let's play a little history what if for a moment. What if Byzantium falls just like it did, but the Mongols never invade? Right. Russia just sits there then, isolated from most everybody else. No other major cultural connections to benefit from. I mean, what would happen to Russia at that point? Right? It could very well just die out. And or it could just sit in stasis. Like the rest of the world would keep moving on and improving, and Russia just be sitting there chilling in the 1400s. Right, somebody would probably invade them, and they would come across a civilization that was 200 years behind. So again, as bad as the death and destruction was, what's that?
You might have altered all history of the world. You might not have had the Soviets rise up and the entire...
Exactly. Exactly. Possible. James?
We also would never have Tetris.
It's very true, and the world would be the world would be the poorer for it. Although that would have saved me from getting a C in high school chemistry. It's true. Because the TI-83s were relatively new when I was a junior in high school. And second semester I got Tetris on my graphing calculator. And it was all downhill from there. Stupid Tetris. Okay. So the Mongol invasion actually has a silver lining for the Russians once you get past all the death and destruction. Because from the Mongols, Russia is centralized. They go from being this loose collection of kingdoms ruled by princes. They go from being, this loose collection of kingdoms that looks a lot like Western Europe used to. All these rival groups fighting with each other over little tiny pieces of land. They go from that to being centralized. And they were centralized because of the Mongol taxes. Mongols said, pay us tribute or we'll crush you. Tribute from all of these different kingdoms. And the Russians are looking at each other like, we don't know how to do that. We have no way to organize this. We have no way to collect the money from all these different places. We're going to die. And so the Mongols helped set up the collection point. And what is the collection point? Moscow. So now Moscow essentially becomes the capital. All roads lead to Moscow. All goods come to Moscow. All the tribute comes to Moscow. What happens when you suddenly start sending lots of money and people to one place?
It gets rich.
It gets rich, and with riches comes, well, corruption, but what else? Rich people, who then do what with their money?
Spend it.
Spend it, which leads to trade, and trade of goods and trade of ideas. All right, so Moscow is going to become a cultural center as well as an economic center. Anytime you send more people to one place, you are going to have the spread of ideas. So Moscow gains power, gains wealth, gains knowledge, gains culture, and becomes the center of the Russian world. All because of the Mongol invasion. And so then as the Russians eventually begin to think about resistance, as the Russians eventually begin to think about kicking out the Mongols, that glorious day when we can kick them out and regain control of our country, what's step one to that plan? Well, what are you going to have to kick the Mongols out? An army. And so Moscow will then also become the military center of Russia. So what happens to Moscow then once the Mongols are kicked out? I mean, does it suddenly lose all its power and wealth and prestige and culture and go back to the way it was before? No. It keeps all that. And so now that the threat of the Mongols is gone, Russia still has the same power that it did before to control the rest of Russia. The other parts within Russia, you mean, or other empires outside of it? Oh, yeah. I mean, once the Mongols are gone and Russia has established its independence, there will be some trade between Russia and other civilizations. And again, all that's going to funnel through Moscow, which only makes it richer and more powerful. Now, to help keep that control, you want to get everybody in Russia on the same page. You want to make people as alike as possible to cut down on the conflicts. And so one of the best ways to cut down on conflict is to pick one religion out of the buffet of religions that Russia has available to it. And so they choose Eastern Orthodoxy as the Russian religion. And will eventually put their own little twist on it, and so today we call it Russian Orthodoxy, or the Russian Orthodox Church. But much like other civilizations, they try to use religion to unify their people. If everybody believes the same thing, it's easier to be on the same team. No. And so that's where you see the next bullet point. We're going to persuade people to become Orthodox by outlawing other religions, punishing other people that practice other religions, and basically make life difficult for anybody that's not an Orthodox Russian. And what do we know about the Eastern Orthodox Church in terms of who rules it? Right, the leader of the country. The political leader is also the religious leader. And so as Russia now has a centralized government, and what's the title of the ruler of Russia? The Tsar. The Tsar will lead both the government and the church. All the power in one place. Kind of convenient. How does that compare to Western Europe? Right. So in Western Europe, you have a division between church and state. You have kings or emperors or whomever running kingdoms and countries, and you have the Pope running the church, and you have conflict between them. In Russia, all of that power is in the hands of one person. Who does that sound? I mean, in what other civilizations do we see that? In China? Where else even more so? Because in China, religion wasn't always that important. But where else do we see a place where religion and government are both really important and all that power is in the hands of one person? Islam. The Abbasid Empire, the Ottoman Empire. And so we're going to see some similarities between Russia and those places. All right, we good to go? Okay. All right, so let's talk about this expansion. Now, I'm assuming we've already beat this horse enough. Why do the Russians expand and conquer? Destroy the Mongols. So I'm assuming we're done with that one, right? We're good? Don't need to mention it again? Except to say this. How do you push the Mongols back far enough that you no longer feel threatened? You kill all of them. Is that really possible? With a big enough army. What are the chances? And again, if we can go back to our map. Paul, can you hit the keyboard left, maybe 2 slides? Left. Left. One more left. All right, how did you do that? Left, 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 left. There we go. Thank you. Good work. Okay. Just look at the map for a moment and let the sheer size of this sink in. How big would your army have to be to push people back and keep them out throughout even just the green area?
You need a lot of men and a lot of armies.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about like hundreds of thousands of soldiers.
Or just a lot of
But I mean, the cannons take people to fire and reload them. They're hard to turn. To keep, and this is the important part. I mean, the fighting for this land, fine, no problem. But if you're fighting against nomadic people, they're just like, all right, fine, we'll see you later. And they leave for a year, and then they come back. So to keep this land under your control, you would need a monstrous army. And what would the problem with that be? The cost. I mean, it's impossible. So how do you keep all that land and make sure the Mongols don't come back once you've fought them off of the land?
Take their money.
Don't pay the soldiers.
Don't pay the soldiers? Here, go risk your life, but you're not going to get paid for it. And by the way, buy your own gun. I don't see that being very effective. How do you do it? You establish cities. Okay, that's hard because that requires a mass migration of thousands of people. Well, you're not far off. You guys have a great example here that you've been learning about all through middle school. How did people settle this country? Did they march out with an army from coast to coast and conquer everything? No, what did they do? Settlers. Pioneers. You told people, and that's why the covered wagon is there. I was hoping that might jog your memory. You're like, I wasn't even looking at that. I was too busy copying words. You tell people, look, head east. Find land. It's yours. If you can settle on it and build a house and start farming, it's yours. That's how you do it. You let your own people fight for the land that they want. You don't need an army. Yeah.
Back in bringing back the American invasion, the Native Americans fought all the people.
Yep.
So didn't the Mongols and everyone else try to fight them and make them lose?
Absolutely. And so we're not saying there was no fighting, but now you've got Russian people that are fighting to get their own land. And they're fighting against Mongol people trying to keep their own land. And so it's a very similar struggle to what you saw play out here in the Americas as the pioneers and the settlers moved west and had to fight against the American Indians. Very, very similar story. And just like here, there was no way the early United States could have raised an army big enough to fight all of the American Indian tribes from Ohio all the way down to Florida. So instead, you send out the settlers. You let them fight. Some of them die, some of them live, but slowly, 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 they claim that land and push the American Indians back. The same thing happens in Russia, except they're going east. March east, claim land, push back the Mongols. March further east, claim more land, push back the Mongols. Until what you find over a span of 200 or 300 years is that Russia controls all of that territory we saw on the map. And interestingly enough, here, who were the settlers and pioneers? Wealthy nobles? No. Peasants. Lower class people that had no other option. That's what we call them in Russia. We call them Cossacks. The Cossacks are peasants. Lower class Russians with no better option than to risk their life and the lives of their families by packing up all their stuff and heading east and settling in the wilderness and fighting against the Mongols and claiming land. Nick?
How's the contact to the people you were wearing horses and cause trouble with the Russian emperors?
Cossacks become those people once we've had this period of expansion and they've gone out and claimed their land. Now, once you've claimed this land and you've established yourself and you've grown crops and you've become a little bit wealthier, you're now going to have this frontier nobility, which is what the Cossacks become. But at the outset, these Cossacks are just peasants, people with no better option. Now, we also talked about how do you make everybody get on the same team as far as religion? Well, you kick out people that don't like you. And so the Russian czars will make it very, very obvious that if you are not an Orthodox Russian, you are not welcome within the established boundaries of Russia. You're going to be exiled. They will kick you out. Well, guess what the upside of that is?
They help the Cossacks get more land.
They help the Cossacks get more land because now these old believers are going to be heading eastward and settling new land, trying to find a new home.
Were the old believers Christians, or were they?
Some were Christians that just didn't like the Orthodox Church. More of them were probably the pagan followers, the people holding on to their traditional beliefs. Tarina?
How would they use east and settle if they were part of Russia? Wouldn't it still be them being Russian?
Well, and so what you're going to find is that over time they're going to have to keep moving. But just like here, you got the original 13 colonies. If you move to Ohio, you're on the frontier and nobody's going to bother you. But before too long, Ohio becomes a state. Oh crap, now we got to move again. So move out to like Oklahoma. Nobody's going to bother you until that becomes a state. And like, oh crap, we got to keep moving. So that's going to be some of what happens with the old believers. Nick?
Contact and the idea of frontier nobility. What was the correlation in the American? Was there
You don't see it quite as much, but that's also because the Americas didn't really have a tradition of feudalism. But you're going to see a great deal of entrepreneurialism in the American frontier. People that set up massive farms, huge livestock herding operations, gold digging, mining, things like that. Okay. And so what this means then, as Russia expands its borders, is it comes into contact with all kinds of people. And so what this might look like at first is that Russia's becoming even more and more diverse. More cultures that they come in contact with means more ideas, more foods, more styles of clothing, more whatever. But do the Russians seem terribly interested in other cultures based on what you're seeing right here? Right, other than Western Europe, they really don't. They don't really seem to be valuing Mongol culture or valuing the cultures of anybody in Eastern Russia who's slowly being pushed off their land. So on the surface, this might look like Russia's getting more diverse, getting new ideas. But maybe in reality, what's actually happening is that they're losing some of the cultural richness that Russia had, and they're trying to make everybody conform to this one idea of a Caucasian, Slavic, white-looking Russian who believes in the Orthodox faith. And again, this will be a problem that Russia wrestles with even up to today. All right, we look at trade in Russia. It looks a little funny. Oh, sorry. Importance of wars with Sweden. Once Sweden is finally conquered, there is no significant Eastern European civilization that Russia has to deal with. And so at that point, it becomes exactly the geography that we talked about before. Western Europe, giant black hole that nobody remembers, Russia. So once Sweden and Poland are out of the picture, there's nothing there isn't a significant enough threat to Russia that we will spend any time learning about. That's a really good question. Paul, think you can handle going back to that map for me? Beautiful. Well done. What you're going to find is that as Peter the Great expands all the way out here, and then Catherine the Great finishes it off, they will make the jump across to Alaska, and then even colonize down the coast of Alaska into the Pacific Northwest. What's the problem with expanding that far? Holding on to it. If your capital is here and your new territory is here, I mean, it's practically on the other side of the world at that point. It's hard to respond to trouble. It's hard to send new supplies or send support or whatever when it's needed. It's hard to figure out what's happening there in a timely manner. I mean, if you think about it, the fastest form of transportation at that point is either boat or horse. So if you've got a colony here, they're going to have to send the message by water, maybe to here or maybe to here. But then how do you get that message from here to Moscow? You ride a lot of horses. Because up here, Titanic. So until you get the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which is like the 1800s.
It's late 1800s.
Yeah.
Designed by the last czar.
Yeah. You don't have an efficient way to communicate or send supplies to these furthest extremes of the empire. And so that's why expansion, especially to North America, is so hard. Yes. All of them. All right, Paul, take me back. What's up, Nick?
So, did the Russians technically own Alaska for they sold it to us?
Yep.
Did they make any attempts to colonize it? Or
Some. It was just way too hard. Plus, again, if you got... I mean, has anybody been to Alaska? Okay, me neither. I really want to go. What do you guys all know about Alaska? It's cold. All right, so how do you hang on to that kind of territory? It means you have to find some of your people that will willingly go there and stay there. And so that's part of the reason too, is that part of North America is hard to claim and maintain, because how do you get people to stay there? Right. I mean, you have to find some way to encourage.
You conscript some people, take them on a boat, jump them there, and say, "You live here now find a way to survive."
And that's kind of like what we do with Australia. All right. So as far as trade goes, and we'll try to wrap this up because I know we're coming back from the break and we're all a little not used to waking up this early. I'm guessing many of you were still sleeping at about this time last week. Okay, anyway. So, trade for Russia. Or do we need to give you all 30 seconds to talk about how much you did or did not sleep? Okay, no, we don't. All right, so as far as trade in Russia goes, Russia's merchant class develops a little bit oddly. As Russia heads east, is there anybody major to trade with? No. So what would be the only purpose of merchants?
Sell things to the people they conquer.
Right. It would be to connect the frontier with Moscow. Are you going to make a lot of money as a merchant selling things to the frontier people? Maybe. But as merchants, you make most of your money by selling high-priced items. Do people on the frontier need luxury goods? Jewels and spices and fancy clothing and things like that. No, what do they need? They need like pots and pans and shovels and guns and things like that. You are not, as a merchant, going to make a lucrative living selling to frontier people. Now, you might be able to make enough to keep your store open, and as long as you don't have any ambitions of becoming rich, great, go do it. But if you want to become a rich merchant, can you do it in Russia? No. And so Russia's merchant class is very, very slow to develop for that exact reason. There are no other major centers of civilization to trade with as they head east. Now, could you trade with somebody to the west? Oh, yeah. But here's the problem, is by the time Russia is ready to trade with Western Europe is already so much more sophisticated. It's easier for Western European merchants to do all the work. It's actually easier for French or German or Italian merchants to make the trip to Russia, bring goods, trade it for Russian goods, and bring them back. So if you're Russia, do you really need a merchant class? Not really. But if that's your relationship with the West, where they do everything for you basically, they bring you their stuff and they take away your stuff. If you're Russia, do you get all the benefits of trade at that point? Well, you get some of the benefits. You get the stuff. But consider the benefit of Russian merchants traveling to Paris or London or Berlin or Rome. If you're a Russian merchant and you walk into Rome or Paris, what do? You do this for 5 minutes straight. And then you're like, oh. But you are exposed to so much that when you get back home to Russia, you go to your friends and your family, you're like, you will have no idea what I just saw. If instead, the Western Europeans bring you their stuff and drop it off and take your stuff and take it back home, do you ever get that cultural experience? No. The one thing the Russians have to offer is what, Stephen? Food. A crap load of food. Russia is what's affectionately known as Europe's breadbasket. It's hundreds of thousands of acres of grain. Wheat, rye, barley, whatever. They grow it, they harvest it, and the Europeans come and pick it up and take it back home. So, yeah, Russia gets some cool stuff from Western Europe. But Western Europe gets a whole bunch of food to continue to grow their population. And so what we find is that Russia develops culturally very, very slowly. And they really struggle to get these outside ideas. Your book talks about a great example of this. Do you guys know what this is?
Yeah, that building.
It's that building, yes. It's the it's the Onion. Right, it's the Kremlin. It's the Capitol building in Russia. Well, it's considered to be like the central public building in Moscow. So like you could make the argument in DC, you know, what's the Capitol building? Is it the Congressional building? Is it the White House? You know, which one is it? If you go to Moscow, you go to the Kremlin, you're like, that's the building. The Russians didn't know what to build. They didn't know how to build their big central building. They didn't know how it should be designed. Not just structurally, but aesthetically. They didn't know what Russian architectural style was because they didn't have a Russian architectural style. And so they actually had to bring in architects from Western Europe, and they say, could you build us a building? And these Italian and German architects are like, yeah, sure. What do you want it to look like? And the Russians are like, well, we want you to create what you think Russian style is. We want you to tell us what our style is. Yeah, it's like a reality show challenge. Come tell me what I like and then build it for me and I will like it. Yeah. And so you find, it's almost like a Disneyland kind of thing. Because Western Europeans didn't know what Russia was like. They had these vague ideas of what Russia was like. This kind of like far off, you're kind of European, you're kind of Asian, we don't really know what to do with you. So they create this fanciful architecture. It looks like something out of a children's book. Like you could put gumdrops and frosting on this and it could be a pretty close approximation of a gingerbread house. Yeah, it could be in Candyland. Like this does not look real. And that's how Russia gets its style. It gets imported. Russia gets told what its style is. That's part of the relationship with the West. And so that's why we say, or lack thereof. Because it's really not much of a relationship. The Russians the Russians get Western goods brought to them. The Russians get Western ideas brought to them. It's a very dependent relationship. And Russia will be behind Western Europe for pretty much their entire existence. Fast forward to the World Wars. Russia fights World War II with weapons that we were using during World War I. They fight World War I using weapons that we were using during the Civil War. Like Russia just doesn't seem to be able to catch up or surpass Western culture. It's a very dependent relationship.
They were supposedly unable to catch up or surpass Western culture by World War II. How come they won?
How come they won World War II?
Yeah.
They didn't. They helped win. But they had something that the Germans didn't, which was a war on one front. The Germans had to fight the Western Front and the Eastern Front, just like in World War I. And the Russians could take their 10 million man army and throw it against the German machine guns wave after wave after wave until they finally overran it, which is how they won in Stalingrad. So at that point, it wasn't technical superiority. It was just sheer numbers, which has always been Russia's greatest advantage, that and winter. But even during the Cold War, the United States makes the atomic bomb, Russia makes it later. The United States makes the hydrogen bomb, Russia makes it later. Russia was always playing catch-up.
Except when they got mistakes.
Right. And that's why that was such a shock. It's because people had gotten used to Russia always playing catch-up, and now all of a sudden they put up Sputnik. All right, quick chronology of leaders. You do not need to know all of these people. I'll point out the ones that are really important. The rest is just to give you an unbroken chronology. Because otherwise, if I had huge gaps between leaders, the obvious question would be, well, what happened there? So, the first two you need to know. Ivan the Great, otherwise known as Ivan the Third, is the guy that begins kicking out the Mongols, which, as we've already covered ad nauseum, is kind of a big deal. Ivan the Fourth, which later gets the nickname Ivan the Terrible, actually started out doing pretty good. Maybe not great necessarily, but he could have been Ivan the Pretty Good. Because he was continuing the Eastern conquest, he was continuing to kick out the Mongols, and then something sad happens. His wife dies. And it goes from sad to tragic because Ivan IV is convinced that the Russian nobles were out to get him. and that they actually plotted to kill his wife, and they had her poisoned. And so, in a rage, he starts rounding up and killing Russian nobles to get revenge for his wife. Russian nobles are called boyars. That's when Ivan IV becomes Ivan the Terrible, is when he starts exterminating his own people.
Is he the one who created the secret fleet?
Peter the Great. Now, after Ivan the Terrible, prior to that, power had been passed down through heredity. So, father to son, father to son. After Ivan the Terrible, there was a consensus amongst the surviving Russian nobles. We don't really want anybody else from this family in power. That seems like a bad idea. And so they vote, essentially, to have a new noble family take over rulership in Russia. And so that's when you get the family of the Romanovs, and that will be the last dynasty in Russia. And the Romanovs will stay in power all the way up through World War I. So they have a good long run. 300 years. And so in this Romanov line, you really don't need to know the first two. Michael Romanov continues the expansion, but he doesn't really do anything memorable. His son, Alexei, or Alexis, if we want to Americanize it, it would actually be pronounced Alexei, which isn't a girly name. He really emphasizes the government's control over the church. But again, don't really need to know that. The two you need to know are the last two pictures on the bottom. Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Peter the Great is going to be responsible for really turning Russia around culturally and helping them begin to catch up with Western Europe, which again is what we mean by Westernization. To become like the West, to Westernize. And we're going to talk a little bit about what exactly that means for Russia. And then after Peter the Great, Catherine the Great will finish off the expansion that you saw on the maps. She's the one that'll claim Alaska and parts of the Pacific Northwest. And she will, I believe the phrase your book uses is she will flirt vigorously with Westernization. It's a really odd phrase. But what they mean by her flirting with Westernization is that, you know, she dabbles in it. She pretends like she likes some of it.
Wasn't she a
Mm-hmm.
German?
That's one of the other fun phrases in the book. Your book actually says that he was a retard. That's the phrase your book uses, which was actually how I knew that very, very few of you had read, because any other year, most people are running into the classroom going, Mr. Ackerman, did you know the book says retard? Yes, I do.
Does it use it in the offensive sense?
No, it uses it in the he is mentally handicapped.
Clinically retarded.
Right.
Okay.
But when we say that she flirts with Westernization, she is also unwilling to commit wholeheartedly to it, which is why they use the phrase flirting. There are many aspects of Westernization that she just doesn't like.
Like what?
Well, once the Enlightenment starts and Western Europe becomes more and more democratic, she decides that's where that relationship needs to end. Now, the one thing that we didn't get to, but it'll be up on Vision, is the list of all of the changes that Peter the Great implements through Westernization. He adopts Western-style government, which by this point is an absolute monarchy. So a czar with total power. He's the one that creates the secret police to make sure that the people do what the czar wants, and if you don't, then you get taken away in the dead of the night and nobody ever hears from you again. He creates an opportunity for people that want to become part of the government to become part of the government, kind of like China's civil service exam. He really tries to develop Russia's industry to get them beyond just agriculture to work on mining and metalworking. They actually do pretty well. He has problems solving Russia's issue of serf labor, though, because up to this point, Russian serfs were basically slaves. They could be bought and sold from one lord to another. They could actually be gambled in some extreme circumstances. If a couple of Russian nobles are sitting around the card table and they didn't have enough cash on hand to cover a wager, they could add 4 or 5 or 6 of their serfs to the bet. And if they lost, the serf would wake up the next morning and he'd be like, well, sorry, you've been traded. A lot of the westernization, though, impacts culture more than economy or government. I think I told you guys one of the things that you were supposed to read about was the treatment of women. Right. And Russian women, traditionally, when they were married, their dad would give their new husband a whip to keep them in line. Peter the Great decides it's about time we end that tradition. And so he removes the practice of passing down a whip in marriage. Again, does that radically improve women's treatment? Not necessarily, but it's a step. Something else he does,
In the right direction.
Russian men during the Mongol conquest had become very, very fond of Mongol fashion because you emulate the popular people. That's why we all love skinny jeans now. When the Mongols were there, they were the cool kids. They set the fashion standards. Long beards was a typical Mongol fashion. And so Russian nobles adopted long beards. Peter the Great says, look, the Mongols are gone. We need to be Russian. And so he famously has ceremonies where he takes these long scissors and he takes the boyar's, the noble's beard, and snip, snip, snip. And so you get a much more fashionable, short, pointed beard. Yeah. No, they were not, which gets us to our last point. The upper class is furious about this because they feel like they're being treated like children, told how to dress, how to wear their hair. The lower class is okay with some of these changes, but they're also annoyed that so many Western things are coming in. They feel like that their sense of being Russian is being taken away. Russian nobles were learning French. Russian nobles were speaking French more often than they were speaking Russian. And so their serfs are looking at them going, you're not even a real Russian. Don't parlez-vous français with me. Ну по-русски. So no, people are not wild about this westernization process, but it's a start. And again, Catherine the Great will flirt with it a little bit more as she continues her rule. All right, so here's what we're doing next class. We are going to do the mini Socratic seminar. So rather than the whole class thing, we're going to have you do smaller group discussions. These are the 4 topics that we want you to address. Hey, Paul, click the blinking red dot at the top of the screen. Or hit the stop button, actually.